welcome to the Humanities Connections webinar for prospective applicants. I'm Hannah Schell, and I am the program lead for the Humanities Connections grant program, and I work as a program officer with the NEH Division of Education Programs.
And hello, my name is Sarah Booney, and I'm the program analyst for the Humanities Connections grant program.
This is the second of 2 webinars created to help prospective applicants. If you haven't already, check out the first webinar, which looks at the purpose of the grant and mentions examples of projects that have been funded. In this second webinar, we'll look at the program resource page located on the NEH website and talk about how to navigate within the Notice of Funding opportunity. We will then look at the different components that make up an application and offer some tips for putting together a strong proposal. We will end by reminding you of some important deadlines, and we'll also talk about the review process for applications. So just to recap what the Humanities Connections program is about, we're going to start with an overview and just to remind you of some of the crucial elements of this program. The Humanities Connections program seeks to expand the role of the humanities in undergraduate education at 2- and 4-year institutions by encouraging partnerships between humanities faculty and their counterparts in other areas of study. These awards support the planning or implementation of curricular projects connecting the humanities to the physical and natural sciences, pre-service or professional programs, including law and business, computer science, data science, and other technology-driven fields, or other non-humanities departments or schools. Projects must incorporate the approaches and learning activities of both the humanities and non-humanities disciplines involved. And at this point, I want to mention that although in the past we have required it, an experiential learning component is no longer a requirement of this grant program. Applications for this current cycle will be due September 7th, 2023, and that's for projects that could start as early as June 1st of next year and must start no later than September 1, 2024. Projects at the planning level last 1 year with a budget of up to $50,000, and those at the implementation level last up to 3 years with a budget of up to $150,000. And we'll dive a little bit deeper into what that means between a planning or versus an implementation a little bit later in the webinar.
So to navigate to the Humanities Connections landing page, you're going to go to NEH.gov and click on Grants in the top right corner. You will then see a list on the left, and if you click on Divisions and Offices, it will take you to a page with a list. There you'll click on Education and scroll down to Humanities Connections, or you can access it directly at the URL listed here. This slide shows what you will see when you access the program resource page or landing page. On the right side, you will first find the grant snapshot, which is a place where you can find the relevant dates and deadlines for quick reference. On the left portion of the page, you'll find a short description of the grant, its purpose, and the elements for a competitive proposal. Since we covered this in our first webinar, we won't go into detail here. But as a reminder, as with all NEH grant programs, your proposal should present a project that meets the requirements of the particular grant program. If the project you have in mind doesn't meet those criteria, and it's not about undergraduate education, or it doesn't involve both humanities and non-humanities faculty, then I suggest reaching out to a program officer to see what other NEH grant programs might be a better fit. Under the Program Resources header, under Step 1, lower on the page, will be a helpful frequently asked questions document, links to recently funded projects over the past few years at each level for both planning and implementation, sample application narratives that are taken from proposals that were successful and were awarded funding. We have 4 examples for each level, so you can see a variety of topics, types of institutions, and approaches. We always say that these are samples, not models, so you don't need to do what they do or how they did it, but we hope that you see that these samples help you see how these applicants crafted a persuasive presentation and explanation of their project. Seeing a real life example may help you as you work through how to balance breadth and depth in your proposal, being clear and concise and simultaneously getting across the big picture of what you're aiming at and enough concrete specifics to show us how you'll get there. The rest of this presentation moving forward will roughly follow the order of our Notice of Funding Opportunity or NOFO document, if you wish to follow along with your copy as we go. While today's presentation will not cover every detail contained in the NOFO, we will give a general overview, highlight some of the most important parts, and clarify some points of common confusion. To access the NOFO, visit the Humanities Connections program page, scroll down to step 1, and under application materials, you can find the link. You can see it circled here on the screen. And below that, you can see the resources that we covered in the previous slide.
So our Notice of Funding Opportunity, the NOFO, is a complex document. So let's talk about how it's organized and what that means to you as you begin to put together an application. The Notice of Funding is your blueprint for how to build a strong application. So we encourage you to become very familiar with it and to use it as a kind of roadmap that will help you put your best foot forward for success of your project. The NOFO begins with an executive summary, which will include the information we just went over, including the purpose of the grant, the 2 levels, the deadlines, and the allowable project start dates. Below the executive summary, you'll find the table of contents. The first 3 sections tell you about the program. The 4th section tells you about what you need to apply, including a table of items to make sure you've included everything that you need. And the 5th section tells you how your proposal will be reviewed. So let's talk about these 2 funding categories. You may be trying to decide, should you apply for an implementation grant or for a planning grant? Don't be swayed by funding amounts or timelines. You should pick the one where you can be most successful and make an appropriate case, given the stage of development that you and your colleagues have reached with your curricular plans. And you'll get a good sense of each level from the funding category section on pages 1 to 2 of the Notice of Funding. You want to read those carefully, as what I'm giving here is just a rough and ready guide to help with your decision making. So the language there says about implementation that implementation proposals must show unambiguous evidence of prior planning and present a defined rationale with clear intellectual and logistical objectives supported by institutional leadership. The award provides the opportunity to build on faculty, administrative, or institutional partnerships and to develop and refine the project's intellectual content, design, and scope. You should clearly demonstrate any partners or collaborators' commitments, outline preferred approaches to curriculum building, consolidation, and explain outreach strategies to attract students to the new educational opportunity. The outcome of an implementation award should be a sustainable curriculum or initiative ready to enroll students. So, if you're applying for an implementation grant, you should be ready to supply a pretty high level of detail in your proposal when it comes to areas such as your project structure and components, the key topics, texts, resources that you would rely on in specific courses, the roles and responsibilities of the individual collaborative team members, including any community partners if you have them, or collaborators at other institutions. So if you're not there yet, you might think about applying for a planning grant. You don't have to get a planning grant to receive an implementation grant, but you do have to have gone through a planning stage and be able to articulate what you've learned from that process. So there's a section of the Notice of Funding that includes some background information that may be of interest to you, and it includes how the NEH defines the humanities and a description of 2 special initiatives. We want to mention these here just so you know about them, but please be aware that your applications, your projects do not have to fit within or address the NEH areas of interest that are listed in the NOFOs. We just want to alert you to these two larger agency-wide initiatives. So the first is American Tapestry. This is a wide-ranging special initiative at NEH that leverages the humanities to tackle some of the most pressing challenges of our time: strengthening our democracy, advancing equity for all, and addressing our changing climate. The initiative encourages humanities projects that elevate the role of civics in schools and public programs, advance knowledge of the country's history and political institutions, and examine threats to its democratic principles. The initiative also encourages projects that explore the untold stories of historically underrepresented groups and build capacity at cultural and educational institutions to benefit underserved communities. Finally, the initiative welcomes projects that promote research into the historical roots and cultural effects of climate change and support the cultural and educational sectors in building climate resilience. In coordination with the White House United We Stand Summit in September 2022, the NEH launched a new initiative titled United We Stand, Connecting Through Culture, that uses the humanities to combat hate-motivated violence and promote civic engagement, social cohesion, and cross-cultural understanding. As a part of this initiative, NEH encourages humanities projects that further our understanding of the nation's racial, ethnic, gender, and religious diversity, examine the sources of hate and intolerance in the United States, and explore progress towards greater inclusiveness.
So the next section of the NOFO, section C, describes eligibility. We talked about this in the first webinar, but it's worth reiterating. So a few words about the baseline eligibility criteria for submitting an application for Humanities Connections. Applicants must be an accredited U.S. institution of higher education, either public or private, with 501c3 status, including community colleges, four-year public and private colleges and universities, liberal arts colleges, research universities, historically Black colleges and universities, tribal colleges and universities, Hispanic serving institutions, and Asian American and Native American Pacific Islander serving institutions. If you're the project director heading the project, make sure that you're affiliated with and submitting it through an eligible institution of higher education. You cannot apply for this grant as an individual. The institution is the applicant, not you. And finally, foreign and for-profit entities are ineligible to apply for this grant opportunity. And now to answer some questions you might have about the number or kind of applications that your institution can submit. Your institution can collaborate with other post-secondary institutions on an application. You'll want to be sure to explain the nature of the collaboration, what the different partners can contribute, and how the logistics will work. Your institution can submit more than one application at the September deadline if they're for distinctly different projects, whether at the same level or different levels, with no overlapping costs. And so long as the institution is prepared and committed to carrying them out, should one or more of them be funded. Each application is evaluated on its own merits, and each might fund both applications, one or neither. Your institution cannot apply for Humanities Connections with the same project that was submitted for another pending NEH application, such as NEH Humanities Initiatives, or for a project whose activities or costs overlap with another application or approved award for federal funding, whether from NEH or another federal agency. But your institution can seek funding from more than one NEH program, such as Humanities Initiatives on the one hand and Humanities Connections on the other, for distinct projects that serve complementary aspects of the same overall goal and do not involve overlapping costs. For example, if your institution is pursuing a new focus on the medical and health humanities, and it submitted a Humanities Initiatives proposal to do professional and curricular development focused on addressing ethics in patient care for its undergraduate and graduate programs in nursing, it can't double dip and resubmit a Humanities Connection proposal that will cover any of the same proposed activities or budgeting for what is already proposed there in the undergraduate nursing curriculum. But it could submit a proposal in a different area of medical and health humanities that your institution wants to focus on and that doesn't overlap in its plans and costs. For example, creating a new certificate focusing on narrative medicine, open to students in all of your health profession tracks, as well as humanities and liberal arts majors, so that if both get funded, your institution will not fall afoul of the prohibition on overlapping costs and will be running two complementary projects that contribute to a larger whole. We strongly encourage you to discuss any plan for multiple submissions or any areas where you might have questions or concerns about these issues with an NEH program officer.
So now let's turn our attention to the components of an application, and we'll focus on the narrative and the budget. I'll explain these parts individually, but remember that they should all work together. Think of your proposal as a unified argument for why your project deserves to be funded by the NEH. You won't be in the room to explain yourself when it is reviewed, so make sure your proposal makes the strongest case. Attachments 2 through 6 are somewhat self-explanatory. The work plan is your schedule for the grant period, and you'll also provide a list of relevant readings, resumes for the personnel involved in the grant, and letters of commitment from the institution. You need at least one letter from institutional leadership, such as a dean or a provost, demonstrating their long-term support for the project. If you're applying at the implementation level, you'll also include an attachment with research on data providing evidence of the progress you've made. And you can read more about each attachment on pages 23 through 26 of the NOFO. Attachment 1, though, deserves some special attention. That is the project narrative, which is the most important part of your application. After the cover page, this is the first thing that reviewers will see, and you should consider it your primary focus. The narrative must be 8 or 10 pages or less. It's okay to single space, but you cannot go on to a 9th or an 11th page. Applications over the limit are removed from the pool, so no matter how good your proposal is, we won't get a chance to see it. I'll say a little bit more about the content of the narrative in a moment, but first let me point out the review criteria. So how can you do your best job of this within your Humanities Connections proposal? Let's take a look at the all-important review criteria, which are spelled out in pages 28 through 29 of the NOFO. You want to keep these at hand throughout your application process. You'll always be keeping these in mind because these are the ways that the peer reviewers and others at the NEH will be asked to think about your proposal. They're grouped under three main headers: intellectual quality, design quality and feasibility, and impact. Intellectual quality stands first and foremost among these as equals, because if your project isn't worth doing in terms of its intellectual significance, then it won't matter how organized you are or how many students it might affect. But if you do have a great intellectual focus for your project, you also have to combine that with a feasible design that can get the job done and that will have a significant impact. So these are all important to address fully in your application. In general, look at what's listed as questions in the NOFO and be sure that an intelligent reader will have strong, positive answers to how well your proposal addresses each of them. Ideally, they'll be won over by the time they finish reading your narrative, and then their positive assessment will be strengthened by what they find in the other attachments that follow it. The narrative is the weightiest part of your application because it carries the bulk of the intellectual content of your proposal. Again, you need to limit your narrative to 8 or 10 pages. Carefully address or answer each of the items under the section headers. And again, remember, you don't get to be in the room to explain your project, so you have to let the narrative be the main force that does that for you, that tells the story of who you are as an institution within your academic programs or areas, what kinds of students you have, and how you are trying to serve them, of where things stand now with regard to the humanities at your institutions, and of where you want to be and the future you want to build. and how your proposed project will use the time and funding from this grant opportunity to get there. You may have to do some of that only in brief compass within the narrative, using case studies for examples, because you can't give us all the details within the limit of 8 or 10 pages. But you want to tell us what we need to know there, and then use the other attachments to flesh out that story, and that gives us confidence in your success.
So in the NOFO, in fact, in all NEH NOFOs, you'll see the kind of crosswalk that we've screenshotted here from page 11 of the NOFO, relating to language in the section of the narrative to the areas of review criteria that apply. And here's a screenshot from page 8 of the NOFO to show you how these different components will need to be included in your ultimate grants.gov submission as PDFs that have the exact file name given here and that observe the page limits indicated. Take note of what is required, conditionally required, or optional. If you do not submit required components, submit a file that is too many pages, or submit a file that is not in PDF format, your application will be flagged as ineligible and will not be reviewed. The hyperlinks will take you directly to the instructions for that section of the application, so read carefully there what it is that you're being asked to submit in each attachment, and you should be in great shape. A helpful tip: don't overdo it. Remember that human beings are reading these applications, so 5 well-curated pages summarizing your planning process are probably more valuable than a 50-page report with all of the details, particularly if they have to wade through those 50 pages to get to the next attachment for your project team CVs and the relevant letters of commitment, which you do want your readers to see and get information from. There's one more part of your application that I want to discuss, and that's the research and related budget form. You will fill out the research and related budget form in your grants.gov workspace when applying. The page looks something like this. The form will automatically integrate into your application based on what you enter here. Because this is a government-wide form, be sure to read the NOFO guidelines on how exactly to fill out the form uh, for this specific grant program's purposes. You can see pages 11 through 21 of the Notice of Funding for those instructions. I know there's a lot of detail there, but don't let it overwhelm you. Many applicants find it helpful to reach out to their grants office for guidance as well. All projects are required to submit a budget justification to complement the budget form itself. The budget justification gets attached as part of the budget form. Be sure to title this file correctly and save it as a PDF to ensure that it successfully integrates into the application file that your reviewers will see. And a reminder about funding restrictions. You can find a more complete list of funding restrictions on page 28 of the NOFO, but I want to caution you against some of the most common pitfalls that we see. The Humanities Connections program cannot fund the isolated addition or revision of a single course offering, the simple pairing of complementary courses versus substantive and purposeful interdisciplinary integration in the review criteria, faculty or student travel abroad, costs for social events. Also, never charge alcohol to federal budgets. That's always prohibited. And finally, all NEH projects cannot fund the promotion of a particular political, religious, or ideological point of view, advocacy of particular program of social or political action, projects focused outside the humanities, including creative writing, creating and performing art, creative writing, quantitative social science research, or policy studies. And some general points of budget advice. Always consult the budget guidelines that are listed in the Notice of Funding. Know what is and isn't allowed. Talk to a program officer if you have any questions. And talk to your sponsored research office because they are going to know information about your indirect cost rate agreement and other requirements that your institution may have.
So now let's focus on some tips for crafting a strong proposal. And I want to say that much of this advice was crafted by Program Officer Rebecca Boggs, and it's good advice. First, some just general tips, and then we'll dive into some of the specifics with regard to humanities connections. Preparation, as always, is key. You want to read the guidelines. It sounds basic, but you'd be surprised how many people don't do that or don't do it carefully enough. The guidelines, the notice of funding opportunity will help you determine if this program is the right fit for what you want to do and at what level, planning or implementation. And they will tell you what you need to put into your application. Next, be sure to look at the sample narratives of successful applications and other resources like the FAQ on the program resource page. We can't emphasize this enough. Talk to a program officer. Don't worry that you might be bothering us. Working with applicants is an important part of our jobs, and it's one that we actually really enjoy. It's exciting to hear about all the things that you want to do, and we want to help you make your application stronger. So you should feel free to call or email any one of us in the Division of Education. Let's return to that list of documents, keeping in mind that the narrative is one part, the most important part for reviewers, but still only one part of the larger application. So to reiterate what we've already suggested, you want to think about how all of the parts of the proposal work together and how they convey a compelling argument for funding your project. In the overall proposal, underscored especially in the narrative, you are making a case. You therefore want to be strategic. You want to be explicit about what you are proposing to do, and you want to be clear so that reviewers know exactly what you're proposing, why it's important, and what you hope to achieve. A good process for approaching your narrative with the goal of making your case is this. Start with the review criteria and keep them in mind as you craft the narrative portion. Make sure to show your project's intellectual significance early in the document, as this will be important to your reviewers. You want them to be able to sort of latch on to the great idea that you have early on. You'll want to provide context, why this project makes sense at your institution and for your students, how the proposed activities fit into a larger trajectory, that sort of thing. And you want to develop a work plan that is detailed, but you also want to make sure that it's realistic. And often reviewers are former project directors, and so they can sense a work plan that has been thrown together or is not taking into account larger processes at an institution. Finally, you'll want to address the likely impact of your project. And this can be focused on your own campus and your own students. It shouldn't be overstated, but you do want to remind reviewers how your project helps further the teaching and learning of the humanities at your institution. You definitely want to consider your audience. You're writing to panel reviewers, NEH staff, and the members of the National Council, many of whom will probably not be experts in your subject. It's very common, for example, for a review panel to contain scholars and experts from several disciplines, historians, literature, scholars, and so on. In humanities connections, you may have scholars outside the humanities who work with or at the intersection with the humanities. At least one panelist will be someone who's directed a humanities connections project, someone who can really understand from the inside what it's like to grapple with not only the content, but also the logistics and the making of this kind of thing. So they know what it's like, and they'll be looking for signs that you know what you're getting into. You want to be sure that your proposal is clear and accessible to an educated generalist. It's a great idea to get a colleague from outside your field to read your proposal to make sure you're not falling into jargon. And as I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that your proposal addresses the review criteria in a clear and explicit way. Finally, show the reviewers that you know what you're doing, that you've thought through the project carefully, and that if your project is funded, it will be successful. Let's talk a little bit about deadlines and the larger review process.
So once you know what to do, we're going to go over a timeline for some of when to do it. We as a division are accepting optional draft proposals or materials for feedback until July 21st. This is approximately 6 weeks ahead of the submission deadline of September 7th. If you have a full draft of the narrative, we're happy to review that. You can send drafts or other attachments that are most relevant, such as the work plan and readings, if you like, which may be looked at alongside the narrative if time permits. But it's also fine if you don't have a full draft ready by that date and would like to get feedback from a program officer that can help you strengthen your application. You can send a project summary and work plan draft, a partial draft that lets us know what direction you're intending to go, whatever you want us to see at whatever point you're at. We're ready to meet you where you are and respond within a time frame that allows you to incorporate our feedback. Final applications are due by 11:59 p.m. Eastern Time on September 7th. So don't wait until the last minute to apply in case of technical issues and to account for processing time to validate your application in the grants.gov system. NEH recommends that you submit your application at least 48 hours prior to the deadline so you have time to correct technical errors, EGMS, our internal grants management system, identified or that you discover after you press the submit button. It is your responsibility to correct errors prior to the deadline. This means make sure to check your email after submission to make sure that your application was successfully submitted and not rejected by the system. This typically happens if you submit documents that are not in PDF format. If this happens, resubmit the corrected files as long as your submission is received by 11:59 p.m. Eastern. The very first thing you should do after this webinar is to ensure that you have two very important things: an active unique entity identifier and a current registration for grants.gov. You may need to confirm these with your grants office. Please note that both SAM.gov and grants.gov are now utilizing a login.gov account to sign in. Registration for the UEI and grants.gov can take up to a month to complete, so check on this straight away, especially if you are a first-time applicant or if your institution hasn't applied for federal funding in a few years. NEH cannot grant deadline extensions for delayed registration. Remember, you are applying as an institution, so you will need to have the proper roles and authorities assigned to you in grants.gov to access and apply through your institution's application workspace. Your institutional grant administrator or other grant management or sponsor program staff at your institution are great contacts for guidance if you're not sure where to find this information or who to contact for access. If they can't help you, contact the Federal Service Desk and or grants.gov directly using the contact and information that you can find in the NOFO. When you're in grants.gov, be sure to select the appropriate package for the level that you intend to apply for, so your application is evaluated appropriately. That is, be sure to select the AKA prefix for planning and the AKB prefix for implementation. Selecting the wrong one is a very common error, so be sure to double check with your grant administrator that you have the correct package.
So let's walk through the larger review process and timeline for what happens after you submit that proposal. It's a careful, multi-step process. At NEH, we make grants based on a peer review process. The first and foundational step is the peer review panel. Once the deadline has passed, we bring together groups of scholars, humanities professionals, and other experts, and as I said, usually somebody who has had a Humanities Connections grant in this case, and we ask them to read and assess the proposals. They provide ratings and comments for each proposal that NEH staff then use to come up with a set of funding recommendations. The panels will convene in the months after the fall deadline, and NEH staff will send their recommendations forward early in the new year in January and February. We then present those recommendations to the National Council on the Humanities, a group of 26 people nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate, who meet several times a year to advise us on grant making and policy. The recommendations of the staff and the council are all presented to the chair of the endowment, who by law makes all of the funding decisions. Regardless of the outcome, you can get the most out of your relationship with the NEH by Several strategies. First, you always want to request the panel review comments. Our panelists tend to be very generous. They offer constructive criticism and make suggestions based on their own experience or insights, either from their discipline or because they themselves have experience running a Humanities Connections grant. It's very useful what you can learn through the panel review comments. Also, you can contact us for additional feedback or guidance. A third strategy is to offer to serve as an NEH panelist. Reach out to us to let us know you're interested in serving for particular grant programs or in general. This is a great way to see how the review process happens, what makes one particular application stand out, and that all can serve you well then when you put together your own application later on. And then you always want to apply again for this and other grant opportunities if you're not funded.
So thank you so much for watching this video. We hope it provided some insight into the Humanities Connections Grant Program. If you have further questions, you can consult the FAQs, which you'll again find on the program resource page. It's the first link under program resources. I hope you'll also join us on June 29th for a live Q&A session about the program. You can also find that link on the program resource page. You can feel free to email questions to us either at the program email hc@neh.gov or directly at our own inboxes, which are listed here. And don't forget, as with most NEH grants, you can send us a draft in advance. Again, this year's draft deadline is July 21st. Thank you again, and we look forward to hearing from you.
Thank you.